I was cleaning out my husband's car when I stumbled on something that froze me in place. A tube of lubricant hidden in the glove box. My hands trembled, but I didn't confront him. Instead, I swapped it with industrial glue. What followed turned my quiet street into chaos, with firefighters rushing to my door. Stay tuned, like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. I sat at the kitchen table and let the silence press against my ears like a thick, unwelcome blanket. The familiar tick of the old clock, my mother's wedding gift, marked each heartbeat with a slow, accusing metronome. Outside, the morning light pooled in the window, harmless and indifferent. Inside, something in me had shifted. Julian had come home from work, with the weight of secrecy dragging at his shoulders. His face carried an exhaustion that wasn't just physical. When he tumbled onto the bed without showering, the faint scent of his cologne tangled with a floral sweetness that did not belong to our life. My hands, which had kneaded dough and folded pastries for decades, went numb. I moved through the house the way one moves through a memorial, careful, measured, pretending everything was ordinary. I found the email like you find a bruise. Unexpected, black, and tender. "You were incredible tonight, Dad." A red heart. The word Dad echoed like a stranger's name. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. The receipt in his pocket said San Antonio, not Dallas. A table for two. A bottle of Cabernet that used to remind me of our anniversary. Each small proof was a serrated edge cutting into the life I had believed in. My throat tightened. I tried to count, silently, how many years had passed where his excuses had sounded like rehearsed lines. 40 years of marriage felt like a stage set, brilliantly lit and false. I didn't react. I wiped my hands on a napkin and went to the garage like someone walking into an interrogation. The SUV was warm. The glove box yielded the tube, sticky at the rim, proof that flattened my breath. I photographed the evidence with trembling fingers, the way a witness photographs a crime scene. The rational part of me cataloged facts, emails, receipts, perfume on napkins. The other part, the one that had baked every morning before dawn, burned with a different heat. Betrayal, humiliation, and a fierce, protective instinct for what I had built. In the days that followed, I became someone I barely recognized. Methodical, steeled. I reached out to an old friend who gave me the number of a discreet investigator. Thomas smelled of tobacco and quiet competence. When he showed me the first photos, Julian arm in arm with Allison, laughing under candlelight, I felt my bones hollow out. It wasn't just the act. It was the audacity. My daughter-in-law, whom I'd taught to fold a flan, whom I'd welcomed with open arms, now shared secret smiles with the man who had promised to be my partner. Evidence arrived in waves. Photos, late-night videos, snippets of conversation recorded from a distance. Each file was like a match thrown into dry tinder. When I listened to Allison's voice calling him Dad, with a warmth that wasn't familial, I felt something fracture inside my chest. There was a plan in their words, contracts, transfers, a whispered ambition to take what I had spent decades building. That cut deeper than the betrayal of affection. They weren't simply cheating, they were conspiring to erase my legacy. I made a choice that was measured and terrible. I gathered the proof, printed it, tucked copies into a heavy envelope, and placed it where it could not be missed. I wired my anger into careful motions, extra hours at the bakery, invoicing, saving copies of messages, arranging meetings under the guise of errands. I watched Julian's routine, tracking the small cracks in his pretense. When he left keys on the nightstand, my pulse knew it was an invitation. The gloves of civility were on, but beneath them, I clenched a resolve as solid as cast iron. There is an odd clarity that comes when you decide to reclaim something stolen. Every sound sharpens. Every face becomes a potential ally or threat. I started to plan with the same meticulousness I used to balance ovens and orders. The idea was not born of cruelty, but of necessity, exposure, proof, a public truth that could not be smoothed over by lies. The thought of confronting them privately felt vain. I wanted a finality that shouted the truth aloud. I wanted the betrayal to be undeniable, to strip away their comfort and reveal the hollow center where loyalty once sat. My hands trembled as I mapped each step, because revenge, like pastry, needs precise measurements. Morning after morning became exercises in restraint. I folded trays at dawn and listened to the town wake up, while the secret I carried in my pocket hummed like a live wire. Thomas fed me updates, meetings observed, shadowed walks, the discrete evidence that would later become an indictment no courtroom could ignore. The more I learned, the more I felt the sick satisfaction that someone finally saw what I had suspected, and yet it tasted of ash. Julian's casualness became a provocation. He spoke of contracts, of meetings, of small grievances at work. Allison's calls appeared on his missed alerts, with names that pricked like nettles. Familiar and intimate. The recordings Thomas captured revealed the architecture of their scheme. Talk of notaries, wording to confuse and coerce, a plan to shift ownership of accounts and signatures when the time was right. It's one thing to be betrayed in the bed of the night. It's another to be betrayed by a blueprint hatched in daylight. I did not tell Daniel. How could I break the only son I had, the man who would one day run with a sledgehammer and a hose because he believed in saving others? My silence was a different kind of cruelty. I wrapped the evidence and kept it near, but not flaunted, like a loaded ledger. When the day came to act, I wanted every truth to be visible, undeniable, impossible to fold away into convenient excuses. I set a trap that used the language of smoke and alarm rather than violence. The mechanics were simple: an ignition timed, a window cracked to call the neighbors, a promise of chaos that would bring witnesses. I thought about the ethics of what I was doing until the moment I reached to swap the tube in the glove compartment. Filling the lubricant with industrial adhesive was a violent metaphor, an act to freeze movement and force a confession in the most humiliating way possible. It felt monstrous and necessary all at once. On the morning that would split our lives, the street took notice. Black smoke curled like a flag, neighbors poured out, and the call was made. Engines arrived, lights strobed against a dawn that had once seemed ordinary. I sat with Mrs. Peterson, heart hammering behind a composed mask, while the audio feed from the hidden recorder transmitted every panic-struck syllable. When Daniel arrived in uniform, boots thudding like a guilty drum, I felt the world tilt. My son, the man who'd taught me to find humor in the hard days, now led a team toward what he thought was danger in our house. The door splintered. Tools clanged. Men shouted to clear a path. Through the headset, I heard Julian's panicked voice and Allison's sharp, frightened cries. The image that unfolded in my head was ugly and precise. Two bodies caught at a moment of sins transformed into spectacle. When the firefighters wrapped sheets and brought them out, I felt the neighborhood's gaze align like a jury. The whispers were merciless. People pointed, laughed, scolded, and filed the scene into narratives that would not be kind. In the sterile light of the hospital, the shame continued its work. I walked halls with my evidence, like a priest carrying relics. Faces studied, authorities murmured, and a curious crowd gathered like a tide. I handed the printed files to the man who mattered, my son, and watched his expression shudder. The divorce papers I slid forward were clinical, a puncture to a life built on repetitive kindness and unattended resentments. He did not rage, he did not plead. He simply walked away, each step a denial that echoed the life we had lost. After the storm, our days settled into new rhythms. Customers returned to the bakery. The bell over the door chimed with ordinary commerce that felt like salvation. Daniel and I rebuilt small rituals, shared morning coffee, summoned smiles over trays of flan, quiet conversations that filled empty spaces. People praised me for strength, for surviving humiliation, but strength has many faces. Mine was a ledger of decisions, each chosen with purpose and consequence. What I kept most fiercely was not vengeance, but the work of my hands. The oven, the proofed dough, the recipes passed down from a younger, hopeful me. Rebuilding was quieter than revenge, less satisfying in a gasp, but more enduring. In those warm mornings, with flour on my fingers and my son at my side, the future returned in modest portions. The house remained a memory of what had been, but the bakery, steady, humming, smoothed by daily labor, became the place where I stitched the edges of my life back together. One quiet evening, I stood in the bakery, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread. I thought of everything I had endured, everything I had survived. Julian and Allison tried to ruin me, but they failed. I kept Daniel, I kept my bakery, and I kept my dignity. Did you like my story? Tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Like, subscribe, and join me for more life stories.